All right, so welcome again. Over the past 2 weeks, we've been looking at some of the Psalms, particularly lament Psalms. So we're studying Lamentations. We've been preaching on lament Psalms, which are songs of individual and corporate cries to God for forgiveness, for mercy, for God's grace. But also, one of the things that I love about the Psalms of Lament that we've looked at is that they start in this place of despair and I need you, God, and I'm so sinful. And they move over the course of the psalm to a recognition that God is gracious, God is faithful to forgive and to love. And then they become psalms of joy by the end, recognitions of, though I may be sinful, though there's many things that I've done wrong, God is, by very nature, God forgives. And even though God doesn't have to forgive us, He does. And we can count on that. Now, I just said all that up, but we're not going to do another Psalm of Lament tonight. Tonight, I want to preach on John chapter 13, 1 through 17. So, if you have a Bible or a Bible app on your phone, would love it if you pulled that up. If not, a portion of it is in the bulletin. Not the whole thing, but a portion of it is in the bulletin. So that's John 13, 1 through 17. And this is happening during the Last Supper of Jesus. So Jesus and His disciples are eating together in the upper room. Jesus is going to be crucified the next day. That's kind of the setting for this. So let me read this for us. John 13, 1 through 17. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for Him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved His own who were in the world, He loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under His power, and that He had come from God and was returning to God. So He got up from the meal, took off His outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around His waist. After that, He poured water into a basin and began to wash His disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around Him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to Him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For He knew who was going to betray Him. And that was why He said not every one was clean. When He had finished washing their feet, He put on His clothes, returned to His place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" He asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. And now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Every time that I read this story, one of the things that strikes me is how well John sets us up to be surprised by the twist that comes. He builds this anticipation towards a climactic event. There's something amazing is about to happen, and then you get to this big twist when Jesus kneels down to begin washing feet. So in the opening verses, right, of chapter 13, we're told Jesus knew the hour had come for Him to leave the world, go to the Father. So the scene is set, right? Jesus knows what's about to happen. The climactic moment of His crucifixion is coming. Jesus knows this. And we're at the dinner. We're given the detail that the devil is already at work in Judas' heart, right? The pieces are in motion for what's going to come. And then verse 3 says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under His power, that He had come from God and was returning to God. That's our setup. So far, seems like something really divine and spectacular is about to happen. Jesus knows that God has given Him all power, that He's about to go back to God. Whatever happens next has to be an epic moment. That's the setup. And yet what does happen immediately after that? And so He got up from the meal, took off His outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin, began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So all of that buildup, all of that, Jesus knows what moment is about to happen, and the devil's at work, and Jesus knows he's got all this power, and then he washes his disciples' feet. That's the twist that comes. This buildup leads to this moment. And I think that highlights, as simple or as anticlimactic as that might seem, it highlights the momentousness and the importance of that act. Because what John has done in just a few simple verses is challenge the most basic image of God that most, if not all of us, hold. Right? No matter what religion or denomination, what sect, whether you even believe in a God or not, right? Then there's one thing that we all know. Every person seemingly knows. If there's a God, God is in charge. That is the basic image of God. We picture God as a ruler, leader, king, one who is above us in every sense of the word. That's God. I think, and again, I could be wrong, but I think that is the most fundamental image of God, whatever else you put on God, in all of humanity. We serve God and God rules over us. That's the image. And yet, Jesus, whom John, the author of the gospel, has already established earlier in the gospel, that Jesus is God on earth. That's not a debatable point by the time we get to this point in John. So God, in the form of Jesus, does the unthinkable. He kneels down to wash the feet of his disciples. Washing feet was the job of servants, the lower class. You would never wash the feet of your equal or your inferior. To do that would be to acknowledge that they have some sort of power or authority over you. And so here in this moment, Jesus is bucking all social convention. He's their rabbi, he's their teacher, and he's washing his disciples' feet. And yet, John makes it pretty clear that this is more than just a socially revolutionary moment. This is a theological and spiritual statement. By washing their feet, Jesus is telling his disciples that the God they worship is not a distant ruler who demands obedience, but a loving God who chooses to work alongside and even, in some mystical way, submit to the humanity that he created, to his own creation. Trying to imagine Jesus' feelings in that moment is a nearly impossible task. As already mentioned, we know that he's been given power. He knows that. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because Jesus does not serve the disciples out of some need for approval or a misguided notion that his authority comes from them, right? This is not a democracy where the disciples have elected Jesus to be their ruler. Jesus knows that his authority, his power have come from God, from himself, because he is also God. Instead, Jesus knows that he's got all of that, and that has nothing to do with it. He knows what's about to happen to him. And there must be a feeling inside Jesus that now is his best chance, using everything that he knows, to teach the disciples, to reach them, to make sure they know the truth about the God that they worship. He's determined to show them what God is really like. Did Jesus feel any humiliation or shame when he washed the disciples' feet? I don't think so. Probably not. Jesus knew what he was doing, even though, from the world's perspective, that would be a shameful or at least somewhat humbling act. He knew what he was doing. He chose to do it willingly with a purpose and a determination. If anything, the disciples are the ones who might feel some shame, because they've been following this guy, and now he's serving them. Their rabbi and master is kneeling before them, taking their feet into his hands. And it's pretty clear. Just look at the way Peter responds, right? John tells us how Peter responds. He comes to Simon Peter, and Simon Peter says, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" It's like shocked. Like, is this really, are you really going to do this? And Jesus says, you don't realize what's about to happen. You don't know what I'm doing, but later on you're going to understand. And Peter adamantly, "No, you shall never wash my feet." And then Jesus answers, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." And so Simon Peter replies, "Then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands, my head also." Peter's always really good for a reaction. You guys who've been here for many of my sermons know that I love Peter because he just blurts out what he's thinking all the time. He wears his emotions on his sleeve. And so in the course of a few lines, we swing from this adamant denial, this complete refusal, to this overeager acceptance of like, yeah, not just the feet, do everything, right? His initial reaction, though, makes a lot of sense because of the high esteem in which he holds Jesus. And I think that his reaction also reveals that Peter is aware that Jesus is God. Peter is aware of Jesus' divinity. He addresses Jesus multiple times in that exchange as Lord, which is a word that is not exclusive to God. It's not just a word for God. But in the context, it seems to be an acknowledgement. Peter at least sort of grasps who Jesus is. And then that makes even more sense out of Peter's initial reaction. Because how is it that Jesus, who is God, is condescending to wash the feet of a poor wretch like me? That's what Peter is saying. And so Peter's first response, no, you shall never wash my feet, is the way that many people react when our most basic image of God is disrupted or challenged. Peter's denying that such an action could come from God. It's not the God that Peter knows. And therefore, he's, no, Lord, you won't, I can't let you do that. It doesn't make sense. He won't let it happen because if the God of the universe washes his feet, then what does that say about God? And what does it say about Peter? Peter thought he understood, he knew his place in the relationship with God. I think we all sometimes think we know, set our place in the relationship with God. Peter is the mostly obedient servant, right, who follows God's laws, does what God commands. We're the lowly one, the supplicant, the one who comes to God. And God then is the benevolent father and ruler who rewards, punishes, all of that kind of stuff. Peter may have had a place in his understanding of God for grace, forgiveness, a place for mercy and love and kindness, but I don't think he had a place in his picture of God for servanthood, for service. Imagining God as a servant rather than as a ruler was outside the bounds of Peter's understanding of who God is. And I think outside the bounds of our understanding sometimes too. Now, Jesus does make it clear that this act of service is about the disciples. The section that you guys have in your bulletin there, John 13, 12 through 17, tells us that when Jesus had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes, returned to his place. And he says, "Do you understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." So this is the conclusion that helps make sense a little bit out of the story for everybody, right? Jesus was demonstrating servant leadership. Now we're called to do the same. Right? If Jesus, the God of the universe, was willing to wash his disciples' feet, then we can and should serve others with gladness. We're invited to relate to one another in a different way, in a new way, in a way in which power does not determine how we treat one another. God is the most powerful and most authoritative ruler that there is, and yet God was willing to serve. Therefore, we have no excuse not to serve others, regardless of any kind of earthly power relationship or anything like that. Now, I've read this story a lot of times, and I think I've even preached on it here before. I'm not sure. But my focus has always been drawn towards that last part, right? The part that I just read, the explanation from Jesus that makes sense out of everything that happens. But I found myself sitting with a different part of it this week. As I read the story for the class that I was in, I had to read through the Gospels for this class that I was taking, and the thing I found myself sitting with was the notion of God as a servant. Because again, I've always thought in terms of serving God, right? Like it's my responsibility to serve God. That's what God wants, is for us to serve Him, and He forgives us, and that sort of thing. Not God serving me. I don't really think of God in those terms very often, that God serves me in some way. And so even when considering the story, I really only thought often in the past about the calling, right? The end part, the calling to serve one another, the practical and relational application of Jesus' actions. In my own image of God, I could accept a God who would demonstrate service for a moment. And I could accept a God who lowers himself to the point of death on a cross for a mighty act, God who lowers himself in the language of Philippians 2. But could I picture a God who consistently and routinely serves his creation rather than simply expecting service? That was the true challenge for me as I read the passage. And I think also it's the key to really unlocking the message of this passage. Because Jesus' act of service is not a one-time demonstration. It's a revelation of the true nature of the relationship between God and humanity. Jesus had all the power and the authority, and he knew it. God has all the power and authority all the time, and God knows it. We don't have to tell God. Yet God also submits his divine will to the humble service of creation. Even without a creation, theologians from throughout the ages have pointed to the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as a relationship full of mutual submission and service to one another. So by the very nature of God being three in one, it is part of God's nature to serve, not just to be served. And one example of many of God's service to humanity that springs to mind for me is our ability as humans to have any kind of free will, to make choices. Because our free will only exists, if we believe in a God who has all power and authority, our free will only exists because God limits himself on purpose. God makes the decision to let us make our own decisions. So rather than thinking of this as some sort of like abstract idea of free will, I can now, and I hope maybe you will too, think of our very free will, our very ability to choose, is an act of God humbly washing our feet, humbly kneeling before us. This is God who by all accounts should have complete control over my every thought and action and word. There's no reason why he can't have that. And yet he's wrapping the towel around his waist and kneeling by my feet and intentionally allowing me to have this freedom. In a sense, to have a power over God. God gives it to me. I did not force it from God. I did not demand it from God. He chooses to give it to me. And it's but one example of the many ways that God is serving his creation at every moment. Our God, the same God who is omnipotent, who deserves to be worshipped and obeyed, also submits in some way to my whims and my will. Now, this is really important. This does not mean I can control God or that I can manipulate God. Right? This submission is a choice that God makes, and one that is made on God's terms. Yet somehow, in some way, my prayers, my desires, my actions are not merely the actions of a puppet pulled by God or a rebellious child punching at the air that are meaningless. Instead, what I do and what I say, what you do and what you say, matter in the grand scheme of God's plan. And in particular, the way that God plans to use you and use me. And only when we fully understand that can we grasp the rest then of what Jesus says to his disciples, that end part that I usually focus on. Only when we see that service isn't just a random act of Jesus, but part of the very fabric of God's nature, can I then accept the call to servanthood myself. Jesus says, again, in that passage, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. And now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet." He's making it clear that what he's done is connected to who he is. Serving one another is not something we do simply to please God, to be obedient to God, although it does please God, and it is being obedient to God when we serve one another. Instead, we serve one another in order to be like God, because that is who God is. That is what God does. And for myself, in my current role as a pastor, as a church worker, the temptation is always for status or power, to be a symbol or a hammer or an advantage, right? We have a great deal, in some sense, we have a great deal of authority in the eyes of our congregants. And so as I studied this passage, I was convicted in the recognition that I often take for granted that I'm not going to have to do certain things because of my position or status. Why should I vacuum floors or wipe down tables or clean bathrooms when I clearly have more important work that I could be doing as a teacher and a counselor and all those sorts of things? Yet that attitude, which I have found myself falling into, is missing the most fundamental lesson from this passage. That God has all authority and the highest position, and yet it is God's very nature to serve. And I think that applies to all of us. We all, perhaps in different ways, have places in our life where we have power, where we feel that we have some level of authority. Even if it's just a friendship with somebody or something at work, or like we all feel like, oh, I'm entitled to not have to do that. I'm above this, right? I put in my dues, now I'm above that. Whatever it is, all of us, the temptation is always to consider ourselves above, to look at ourselves as authoritative in some way, shape, or form. And yet God always calls us to serve, because that's who He is. That's how He lives. Even when He has authority and power, He serves. The invitation from Jesus as He's washing the disciples' feet is to become more like God by getting rid of pride in my own power and position, in whatever you have that pride in, that authority. And instead, to be like Jesus, to be like God, 3 in 1, serving Himself. That I ought to use my power and authority. You should use whatever position you're in to humble yourself, to humble myself, and serve the people around us. Because we've been served by God in many, many ways, day in and day out, from moment to moment. Being served by God right now, because God is a God of service, even though God does not have to do that. And so should we not do the same? Now I'd like us to spend some time in prayer with one another.